Amanda, here to present with us today. She is a leading social psychologist, completed her PhD at Northwestern University, now is a professor at Indiana University Bloomington, one of the top social psychology programs in the world. And they have just been on fire recently, just paper after paper, really changing the field. Publishing in all the leading journals in our discipline, and really has influenced how people think about the goals that different people bring to STEM settings, and how those goals that are kind of in the air can influence whether people feel invited to belong or not. And so, as you all know, the Texas Mindset Initiative is devoted to bringing leading insights from social psychology and other allied behavioral sciences to the UT community so that we can think critically and carefully about our teaching practices, our hiring practices, our TA practices, and so on. And so this is just another fabulous example of getting hot off the presses, leading social psychology here for us, so that we can be inspired and we can figure out how to apply these insights in our own work. So Amanda, thank you so much for joining us, and we can't wait to see your talk.
Thank you. That's a great introduction. And I'm very flattered, and I certainly agree that our group here at Indiana is fantastic, and I feel really lucky to be a part of it. As I said, I cannot see you, but I encourage you, if something needs clarification, if you have a question, please just interrupt me, unmute yourself and jump in, and I'm happy to answer that. It's hard to develop this talk because there's so much that our lab is doing and has done, and so many directions we're interested in going. And so I only pulled out some pieces to talk to you today. And so I'm happy to take questions throughout and after. So please ask me them. So what I want to talk to you today is about a program of research that started about almost 15 years ago now. So some of the work that I'm going to show you is classic because it kind of builds the foundations, and some of it is brand new and still being reviewed and improved in various ways. But our question is, how do different STEM contexts that students envision, anticipate before they're in them, and then their experience in those contexts, so in some of the classrooms like you see here, or the coding club that you see depicted there, how does that inform their beliefs about what STEM is? And then how do those beliefs have different implications for different groups of students given their own motivations and what they seek out of not only their college education, but out of their lives, out of their pathways? The reason we became interested in thinking about beliefs about different careers was that we looked at data in terms of the degrees that women were attaining. So where did we see growth in women's attaining degrees at the highest levels? And what we see when we look at career fields, degree fields that were all male dominated in the 1970s, we see an upward linear trend for all of these different occupations, but the slope is not as steep for the STEM fields, okay? So when we look at fields like law, medicine, dentistry, and business, all of these require high levels of achievement. All of them require high levels of performance, and many of them require that in quantitatively, scientifically based fields. And so the question of, well, what is differentiating STEM fields from other fields that had many similar obstacles was one that our lab set out to answer. What we collected data and came to understand and then posit is that this has to do with beliefs that students hold about the goals that these different career paths afford, and how those intersect with group differences, average group differences in motivation, but also individual differences in motivation. So from what we call a goal congruity perspective, we're working from the idea that people are seeing different career options and seeing experiences in these roles as informing their beliefs about an opportunity structure that they're going to make decisions about, right? So that there are different occupational roles that they might enter, and they will approach those roles and continue and persist and engage with those roles that are seen that they anticipate to meet their valued goals and that actually do meet their valued goals once they're engaged in them. So this is taking a structural framework very seriously, that it's not simply that students, end up in classes, but that they do have goals they're trying to fulfill, but that the social structure they're in, the system of education, and their anticipations about that are powerfully important. So the two core questions that this framework leads us to ask then are, well, what goals are valued and how do we know that about different groups of students? Does learning about women's goals, for example, inform us about these different career paths that are taken or not taken? And more importantly, over time, we think, is how are different roles seen as affording those goals? Do people have different beliefs about STEM fields and certain domains within STEM as affording valued goals? And how do those impact their interest and engagement? So we think about this at multiple levels, and you'll see this come back in various aspects of what I'll tell you today, that as individuals are navigating roles and goals, we can think about how this culture manifests and is communicated and might be changed at different levels. And so here I'm drawing from work with Tony Schmader, where we thought about gender and how the binary construction of gender is reproduced at various levels of culture. But this multi-level framework also makes sense for these questions about STEM as they intersect with gender. So we can think about the institutional level. How do roles or representation within different institutions, whether that's the workplace, a specific workplace, a broad level field, or family roles, how did those influence us? We can think about specific interactions. So any classroom context has multiple interactions with peers, with the faculty member, and so forth, and those can inform our beliefs. And then, of course, we can think about the individual level, that each individual has their own motives and goals, certainly also has beliefs and cognitions about how those goals might be attained. So in thinking about this question of gender disparities in STEM, we can ask these kinds of questions targeted at each of these levels. So at the institutional level, we might ask, well, who's in STEM, who's represented there, not just by gender, but also ethnicity, first-gen status, and so forth. And what goals does STEM afford? And that question, as you'll see, has been most important for our work. We can think about how specific contexts shape these experiences. So whether that's interactions, whether that is assignments or activities and courses, how do those shape my beliefs about what this field is going to be like? And then, of course, we can ask how goals are shaped by gender roles and expectations and socialization. And then in turn, given those goals, what roles might be especially approached or especially avoided? So let me walk you through some of the initial evidence we had for this model, which just laid the foundations of, do beliefs about these different career fields exist? Are they consensual? And then can they predict interest in entering STEM and engaging with STEM? So first of all, before we even get there, let me just show you some brief data to demonstrate what I mean by gender differences and similarities in goal endorsement. These data simply use a binary construction of gender as male and female, and we don't, in these data, give intersections with race and ethnicity, although that's a direction that our lab is looking at now, and some people are doing great work there. So we are interested in two broad aspects of goals, and these are drawn from a wealth of social psychological literature going back to the 1960s. And these are consensually kind of labeled the big two. So communal goals are those that focus on others in various ways, focusing on collaboration or connection or prosociality or altruism. And those specific elements of communality can certainly be broken down and focused on in particular. For the most part in our work, we deal with this umbrella term of communality because it gets us a lot of mileage. There's a lot that can be explained just by this umbrella construction. In contrast, we can think about agentic goals, which focus on the self. And those too include some different factors like dominance over others, independence from others, achievement motivation. But again, agentic goals tend to cluster into this agency umbrella. What we see in terms of gender difference and similarity in goal endorsement is we see Overall, these are college students, more similarity in terms of agentic goals. So these data collapse across 3 studies in our lab, but this is quite consistent with what people in other labs find. Whereas we see a larger difference, a moderately sized effect size, where women are favoring communal goals more than men are. I think it's really important to note, especially as we get into some of the other data, that this is a 1 to 7 scale, and the means are hovering around 5. So everyone thinks that communality is important. It's that women are rating that especially higher. We tend on average to see higher ratings of communality also among students of color in our samples, and Dustin Toman and Jesse Smith and Judy Herkevich have found similar work along those lines. The core contribution of our lab then has been to really think about and document not only those goal endorsements, but what do people think about different social roles and whether they're going to allow you the opportunity to fulfill the goals that are important to you. And so here I'm going to show you data, again, collapsed across several studies that our lab has collected, predominantly college students. And we simply ask them to think about a number of different careers. And then we ask for their impression of how likely is it that if you pursued this career, it would fulfill your goals of communality, so intimacy, affiliation, and altruism, or agency, power, achievement, and seeking new experiences or excitement. And so they rate a number of different careers. We collapse these into clusters, and we're looking at their sense of whether that career group is going to fulfill these communal and agentic goals. What we see here, so the y-axis here is their perception that this career path would fulfill their goals, and the career clusters I'm presenting here are the STEM fields, which is physical sciences and engineering in this particular data. Male stereotypic careers would be things that are male stereotypic but non-STEM, like law, medicine, business. And then female stereotypic careers are things like nursing and social work. And we use these clusters based both on stereotypes about what was male stereotypic or female stereotypic, but also we drew on Department of Labor data to know that these were male dominated versus female dominated. What we see is that the STEM fields are perceived as less likely to afford communal goals than agentic goals. So the purple is communal and blue is agentic. For male stereotypic careers, we don't see that difference. It's not as significant. It's not significant across the samples. And then female stereotypic careers, we see the reverse pattern. So STEM fields are unique and uniquely low compared to these other career groups in their perception, the perception that they will afford communal goals. So if we're seeking to understand why students, and particularly female students, may not be entering into STEM pathways, one answer is certainly not that they see it as less likely to fulfill their achievement goals or their financial success goals, but that they might see it as less likely to fulfill their communal goals. One question, of course, these are college students drawn across majors, not solely social science or psych students, but across the range of university majors. So they weren't STEM students. And so in other data, we've looked at people who are in the STEM pathway in different places. So these are the data I just showed you. So those are college students across majors. When we look at STEM majors, we see a similar pattern, but attenuated. So students who are in the STEM pathway do see STEM fields as less likely to afford communal than agentic goals, but you can see the magnitude of that difference is smaller. We also have a study where we look at pre-service science teachers. So these are people who are in an education track to teach science. And again, we see a very similar pattern to the STEM majors, that they too see this stereotypic pattern that STEM is less likely, they perceive it as less likely to fill communal goals, but it's not as big as the college-wide sample. And so I think these data of students in the STEM pathway are cause for optimism and for caution, right? So it's optimistic that people who are in STEM courses and experiences are getting a sense that collaboration is there, that prosociality, purpose is there, but they're also continuing to show the same stereotypic pattern that it's more agentic than it is communal.
Amanda?
Yes.
You've invited us, taken a brave act and invited us to interrupt you with questions.
Excellent.
Is that actually socially acceptable, or did you just say it?
Oh, no, I believe it.
So a question about the stability of these findings. If you look at law and dentistry and pharmacy, in 1970, had you done these studies, they would look like physics today.
Mm-hmm.
But they have changed. Those fields are all now majority female.
Mm-hmm.
So these constructs would be much stronger if you had measures of their inherent stability.
In terms of the affordance beliefs?
Yeah, so for example, if you look at the current version issues of the American Math Society publications, virtually all the senior officers are female, distinguished mathematicians. It's changed dramatically. So I wonder, I mean, as a social scientist, how do you measure sort of the construct validity of this over time? Are there measures of its stability?
So let me answer this in a couple of ways. One is that we certainly don't want to claim that beliefs about goal affordances are the only thing that matter in those broad level representation shifts, right? So lots of other things changed along as well. And our question in showing that, looking at those overtime data, was really trying to understand, like, at the point where we are now, why are we still seeing lower representation in some fields than others? And this is one tool to explain that. As we move on, you'll see that we actually see that these affordances can shift quite a bit over time, that, like other stereotypes, they they come from observations in the world, at least to some extent. Like, certainly we have some stored representation, but we also observe what's going on in our context and we update our beliefs there. And so I would expect that as we see the role enacted differently, including who's in it, we would see beliefs and affordances shift over time. And I hope that we're able to give you a better answer to that question of overtime change in affordance beliefs, even in a few years, where we'll have, you know, a solid decade of data to maybe be able to speak to that.
In the spirit of interrupting, and thank you, Yuri, for breaking the ice. I had a question. It seems like the way you've measured this, you would say that agentic and communal goals aren't mutually exclusive, like a field or role could have both. Do you think that students would agree with that? Because I would guess that a lot of students would say, if something's much more agentic, then it's less communal. Something's very communal, then it's less agentic. It's one or the other. They, you know, exist on opposite ends of a spectrum. Do you have a sense of that? Do you have any data with that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we do. So Andrew White is a student about to dissertate in my lab, and this is his core question, is about goal structure, and in a multiple goal network, how are students seeing agentic and communal goals as conflicting or as facilitating each other? So on average, I can say that people tend to, on average, they're positively related. So people see contexts that offer more opportunities as offering communal and agentic opportunities, but obviously that's the average, that's not everywhere. And so in an individual difference level, we see some people who see agentic and communal goals, their own goals, when we ask them to spontaneously provide them to us, they see those as in conflict, they rate those as in conflict, and others who see them as facilitating. And Andrew's working with some experimental methods to move towards, you know, can we get people to see the ways that these can facilitate each other and reduce barriers to that, so that is more, you know, can help students in the long run.
Yeah, that was my follow-up question, which I'd be very excited to look at those data. And I think that probably relates to what Yuri was asking as well, about kind of the malleability of these. Do people see, like, is physics the way it is always going to be the way it is, or can I be someone who's able to accommodate both of these goals? And I think individual questions, you know, as interventionists, we're like, let's move people towards this.
All right. Well, let me show you some of those data. So thinking about these, documenting the affordance beliefs, documenting how they map onto different careers, the question then is, why does this matter? And then what, as you said, what can we do to change it? And so, first of all, again, still on an individual difference basis, we know that communal orientation predicts career interests across these different fields, but differently depending on those affordance beliefs. So people who are more communally oriented are less interested in STEM, but this is above and beyond, things that we've traditionally measured like self-efficacy or experience in STEM. And so when we also enter gender into these regression models, we see that, knowing someone's communality accounts for most of the relationship between gender and STEM. Certainly not all of it, but it gives us some good predictive ability, and especially above and beyond the things that are traditionally controlled for. So this on an individual difference level gives us a sense that these goal orientations, along with the affordance beliefs, predict interest. But, one question was, both in terms of establishing that these beliefs are causally related to interest, and also in terms of starting to understand how malleable they were. We did a very simple experiment where we simply, really straightforward, had students randomly assigned. They were told that they were in a study about, different career options, and we were working with the Career Center, and we had them read really brief day in the life of different careers. And they were randomly assigned on a between subjects basis to read about an entry-level scientist. And they read a kind of daily diary of this person. So a couple of excerpts. I come in and check my email and plan the day. I have to check a database maintained by the operations group. So this is the more independent condition. In the more collaborative condition, we try to keep the tasks very similar, but we add in some communal content. We add in other people into this situation. So I have to communicate closely with the operations group to check the status of these experiments. Another example would be I do data analysis and troubleshoot problems that come up by myself. And then the manipulation of a more communally oriented aspect of that would be I mentor new members of my stats group in these analyses. We wanted to keep the difficulty, the challenge of the task, and just the content of the core scientific task very similar across these manipulations, and shift the presence and connection to other people. And so, like I said, very straightforward, very brief manipulation. What we found was that among college students, we found that this framing did boost women's positivity towards STEM and communally oriented individuals, whether they were male or female. So we found that for women, they were less interested in entering a STEM career themselves in the independent framing than the communal collaborative framing. And for men, we did not see a significant difference. So the more collaborative framing didn't decrease men's interest, but it did provide this boost for women, so that when you look across these conditions, men and women are showing equal interest towards entering this particular kind of career. So this way of thinking about, can we move around affordances through explicit messaging, we've replicated it in different ways through thinking about presenting different kinds of role models to students, having them, again, read different tasks, and other labs have as well. So Jesse Smith, Elizabeth Brown have done some really nice experimental work talking about the different content of careers and showing that it can elicit more interest among students. So again, across different research programs and our own research programs, we have some, I would say, pretty solid evidence now that there are multiple benefits to considering infusing communality, communal goals and opportunities into STEM coursework, into STEM descriptions, and so forth. One is that we and others have shown that this perception of communal outcomes or opportunities can uniquely predict STEM outcomes. So it gives us a different lever to push on than thinking about achievement or agentic affordances. There is more and more work showing that the benefits of communality are not just for women and women at predominantly white institutions, like where my data are collected. So we can think about both male and female communicators and perceivers, and increasing number of studies with minoritized students who are minoritized by race or first-gen status. And then there are a number of people doing exciting work in, in real educational contexts, whether it's bioscience labs or following students as they persist with the major over time. I'll tell you a little bit about some of our work that has looked particularly at computer science and engineering. So in thinking about the benefits of integrating communality and STEM, there are a few ways that we want to build on the foundational evidence. One is that we want to think about the different sources of these affordance beliefs. So we know that they can be shifted when we give students direct, explicit messages that this is what a day in the life of a scientist is like. But our work lately has focused more on, well, what are different, more naturalistic ways that students make sense of the goal opportunities and the cultures that they have. And again, we can think about this in terms of institutions, interactions, and the individual level. And so I'm going to show you some data about place. So the STEM context that students are in, some about people, faculty is communicating, and then a study showing that we can also prompt students themselves to generate this more communal content. So one exciting line of work, and this is led by Mansi Joshi, is that we're documenting how motivational culture, this sense of a communal or agentic focus, varies across different STEM domains. And this is relevant to some of the earlier questions. So here we're looking at life sciences students versus engineering and physical sciences students. We see that life sciences students are seeing fairly equal levels of opportunity in terms of agency and communality, whereas engineering and physical science students are seeing a much more agentic focus. They don't see a communal deficit compared to the life science students, but they do see their programs, their majors, as affording more beliefs or more opportunities in terms of agency. What's especially interesting to us is when we follow these students over a year, we see that that gap attenuates somewhat. So it's really early on. These data indicate that it's especially early on in engineering and physical sciences where this belief about a more agentic than communal focus might have its impact. Our question then was, well, can we turn to thinking about what is happening in these contexts of life sciences versus engineering and physical sciences? And can this give us a read on how place, both literally and figuratively, is cueing these different, senses that you can fulfill agentic versus communal goals? And so here we're looking at place in two different ways. More figuratively, I'm going to show you data about course activities in the life sciences versus engineering and physical sciences. And then we will literally, we go and take pictures of what is displayed in academic buildings, and we code those displays for their goal content. So in terms of course activities, here we're looking especially at the low level STEM courses, so 100 and 200 level courses. And we were able to look at assignments, code assignments in Canvas sites, university system-wide across 7 years, thanks to collaboration with the e-learning research and practice lab here at IU. What we found is that life science, very simple main effects. So the life sciences courses across the system included more opportunities for collaboration. So more discussion topics, more group assignments, and more peer assessments. So this was one marker that the kind of experience and environment in life sciences compared to engineering and physical sciences is differing along a communal dimension. We then looked at, as I said, we went into campus buildings. This was pre-pandemic when students were on campus a lot. And we captured images of all of the bulletin boards that were displayed in public areas. And then we had coders from a different university code these for a number of different things, the number of people present, gender representation, but most important for their agentic and communal purpose. What we see here, according to the coding, was that life sciences were perceived as those bulletin boards were portraying approximately equal levels of agentic and communal purpose, but that engineering and physical sciences was, predominantly agency compared to communality. So again, the culture in engineering and physical sciences was favoring agency over communality. Our next question then was thinking about how might people cue affordances. And again, our straightforward experiment was one way that students could get direct information. A different way is that every instructor in a course is conveying messages, not just about the content of the course, but about what it takes to succeed, what success looks like, and what success might let you do. So here we drew from existing work about faculty mindset, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And so we know that faculty who endorse and manifest a growth mindset, that ability is grown and developed rather than innate and fixed, offer a range of advantages to students. And here, this is a collaboration in part with Mary Murphy. We wanted to know whether these growth-oriented faculty, in part, is this benefit, can we see it through differential perceptions of affordances, both in the particular classroom, but also about STEM more broadly. So in this paper that was led by Melissa Feasting, we use a combination of experimental and survey and retrospective methods to document this link, that more growth-oriented faculty are perceived as fostering a local context where both communality and agency can be met, can be fulfilled. So the one data set I'll talk you through is that we had students recall experiences. So here we use a retrospective method. They were randomly assigned to write about a past instructor that had either a growth or a fixed mindset, and we gave them the description of what that is. So what teacher or professor most strongly believed intelligent and talent in math and science is just one of the things that's innate, and others have it and don't, versus it can be grown and developed. What we found is that, they did rate these professors in these different conditions as being more growth or fixed mindseted, but also that growth-oriented instructors were perceived as offering more communal and agentic opportunities. So growth-oriented faculty were associated with a sense that you could do more things in that classroom. So this model shows you that the kind of faculty growth mindset condition, whether they were recalling an instructor who is growth or fixed oriented, led them to see that particular class as especially affording these communal goals of working with others or helping others. It also predicted whether they thought they would have opportunities to achieve in that class, and that both of those were related to motivation to take future courses in STEM. So this is one way that instructors, not through direct messaging about what is important or possible in STEM, but through a broader orientation, lead students to form different beliefs about what's possible in that class. In other studies in the paper, we think about career affordances. So not just in that class, but STEM in general. So finally, the last set that I'll tell you about is we were interested in prompts. So how can we get students, so thinking about the students in this picture, like, are there ways for us to nudge these students to generate their own more communally oriented beliefs about STEM? And can we show similar kinds of benefit from those student internally generated affordance beliefs? What we used here, the tool and method and theory that we used came from construal level theory, which simply argues that in any object or idea, we can represent at more abstract levels or at more concrete levels. And so if we're thinking about communal opportunity or science more concretely, that might lead us to certain beliefs, and we're thinking about it more abstractly, that might lead us to others. We know from other work within construal level theory that, on the whole, greater abstraction leads to seeing things, ideas, policies more in terms of purpose and ideology than in terms of kind of the nuts and bolts. How am I going to do this thing? How will I enact this action? And so what we wanted to do was use this as a tool to experimentally manipulate either an abstract or a concrete construal of a science task, and then see whether the follow-on beliefs about STEM were different, depending on this abstract or concrete construal. So in this study, we had students think about conducting a scientific experiment. So every student in the study was given this target task of think about a scientist conducting a scientific experiment. They were then randomly assigned to think about how a scientist conducts a scientific experiment. Well, they might establish a hypothesis. We then asked them again, well, how do you do that? Well, you develop an idea that you want to prove, and so forth. In contrast, other students were randomly assigned to think about why that scientist might conduct a scientific experiment. So why does a scientist do an experiment? To achieve something that's relevant to the world or people in some way. Why do they do that? Because discovering new things, proving them worthwhile matters, right? So students are either kind of focusing more and more concrete in the how condition, or expanding out, focusing broader and broader in the why condition. After doing that task, participants rated the communal and agentic content of the descriptions that they generated. So we have their own sense of whether their content is communal or agentic, and then they completed our more traditional measures of, how what opportunities does a science career afford, and their own interest in pursuing science. What we see here is that in the low construal, so the how condition, we see the typical pattern that is kind of the baseline stereotype, the traditional stereotype. So under a how condition, when people are thinking more concretely, we see less communal than agentic content. However, in the why condition, when we've kind of nudged students to think about why science is done and why you're taking those steps, we see a significant elevation of communal content, and so that science overall is seen as both communal and agentic. This pattern is more pronounced for women. And so we see overall an effect for women and men, but it is moderated by gender so that it's especially women who are elevating their communal content in this task and in turn elevating their interest. So in this mediational model, we see that this high construal mindset is predicting communal affordances, and those in turn predict this positivity towards entering science. So this experiment was really encouraging to us because it gave us our first evidence that it's not simply that some people have these beliefs and some people don't, or that we can provide students with experiences that shift their beliefs. Both of those are true, but it's also true that there may be some things we can do to nudge students to considering this communal content more, and that they may be able to practice and rehearse that and integrate that on an individual level as well. What I'll give you just a snapshot of now to wrap up is some implications for STEM education, because even though we can nudge students to do this on an individual level as a social psychologist and a social structuralist, I know that those beliefs are going to be more impactful, longer lasting, and more robust if we can change the structures around the students rather than relying on individual students to do this work. So this work was conducted at my previous institution, which is Miami University, and in collaboration with great colleagues in the engineering school there. And so in this work, we had NSF funding for an STEM project, which is scholarship funds directly for students. What we did here is select students for these scholarships based on merit. And we defined merit as including service experience and their vision for how computing or electrical engineering might serve their service goals. So we selected students in part based on communal aspects. We then provided them a communal experience. So some is more traditional, like they lived in a dorm together, they took a course in common together, they volunteered at a community-oriented coding club together, and they studied together. So multiple ways that the communal people and purpose aspect of engineering and computer science can come through. We also had more traditional supports, so need-based scholarships, study space, tutors, money to travel to conferences, and so forth. What we found, and we had 2 cohorts of students apply, enter, and follow through with this program. And so you see year 1 and year 2 data here. The service scholars are the gray bar. The local baseline is the percentage of women students in the college. And then the solid line would be the percentage of women reported by the tech giants at this point in time. So you can see whether we're looking at students who applied, the gender representation among those who were admitted or who matriculated and came to the program, that we were beating that baseline even in year 1 and then especially in year 2. We also found through collecting data, so part of the success was getting students there and getting them in computer science and engineering. But part of it too was that their communal experiences differed as a result of being in this program. So the service scholars compared to, comparison students, honors students or students in first year engineering courses reported that they had more communal experiences in their engineering coursework in their major. They engaged in more service learning. And importantly, they saw that service as connected to their discipline. And I'm coming to see this as really important, that it's not simply that we engage students in community service, but that if we're going to change beliefs about the field, that service has to be connected to their kind of field preparatory experience. So importantly, they then projected their future careers to have more communal opportunities. So having this first and second year experience let them see the possibilities for their future roles in a different way. So in thinking again about these different levels of how local culture is enacted, we did several things at once in this intervention. So we defined merit as service experience and vision. At the institutional level, we provided them with some systemic support so they could engage. And then in terms of interactions, they had classes together, they had a learning living community. The individual level, we selected people who were able to write their application essays in a way that showed that they had communal orientation. So defining that from the get-go as something that's important for the role was one of the important pieces of this. So finally, I want to leave you with some opportunities and challenges to cultivating communal culture. One is making communality visible and valued. So simply, saying that communality, prosociality, connection to other people is important in the discipline may shift attitudes temporarily, but they're not going to stick around. And so we're doing increasing levels of work with instructors, whether it's pre-service teachers or thinking about at the college level, to think through how can assignments and activities genuinely and authentically integrate collaboration and purpose. Are there rewards in the classroom to contributing to a collective good? We can clarify, our research is increasingly working on this, but I think we're seeing it's very important to clarify what forms of communality resonate for different student groups and in different contexts. As I said at the beginning, we have gotten a lot of mileage out of a broad, bringing the broad umbrella construct of communality to the table. But I think we are at the point now where we need to understand, what does that mean to different groups? And so thinking about this from an intersectional viewpoint is really important. And we have some beginning data there. And then finally, as we talked about earlier, we're interested in how we might integrate communal and agentic opportunities. So to the extent that students or contexts are kind of leading students to see this in a bifurcated manner or as a zero-sum trade-off, are there either situational or individual level interventions where we can ask them to think about how their achievement goals do lead them to fulfill some communal goals or vice versa. We do see that for at least some students that overlap is there, they're coming to the table with it. And for other students, we may need to help them to get the benefits of that facilitation in other ways. So finally, I want to leave you with this quote, which I think really speaks to this idea that the agentic goals of what we want students to achieve, what they want to achieve in the classroom, is also a communal and collective pursuit. And bell hooks has been on my mind for many reasons, obviously lately. So this is from Teaching to Transgress, which was formative as I was starting out. It came out right as I entered graduate school and was seriously engaging as a teacher and a scholar. And so she says, as a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, in recognizing one another's presence. Excitement is generated through collective effort. And I think that our work certainly says that the collaboration, connection aspect, as well as thinking through and understanding what excites other people, what is exciting in terms of what this field can do, is a key element of student engagement and motivation and persistence. So to close, let me just thank the many, many people and lab members who've contributed to this work, especially Mansi Joshi and Tessa Benson Greenwald. Thank you.
Fabulous. Lots of muted applause. I want to just ask a question to kick us off, and then I want to invite everyone to put questions in the chat, and we would love to hear from you. So kind of one assumption in a lot of this is that there are opportunities for pursuing communal goals, but something happens. And so I guess I'm curious how much of what you're describing is because our curriculum is not actually affording these opportunities, and how much of it is that they're there, but we don't have the language to lead to that construal. That I just couldn't tell from your talk how much you think is the problem is one or the other.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Melissa Feasting in her dissertation was really interested in this and from a student viewpoint. And so she did in-depth interviews with women in engineering who were juniors and seniors. So they had made it. And she wanted to know, do they value communal goals or do they kind of downplay that aspect? And if they do they see opportunities in their experience to fulfill them? What she found was that the women in her sample, like every single one, highly valued communal goals. So they had not taken a route of kind of downplaying that or dampening that aspect of their motivation, but that it did involve some work on their part. So but they weren't hard strategies. They said like part of it is that I went to office hours and I would ask faculty, I would Google things. And so in some ways, those are low-hanging fruit that could be in a curriculum. They were not, like the students didn't tend to get them through their official coursework, but the faculty were like ready and willing to talk about it if approached. So part of it, I think, are norms within STEM culture that especially early on, it's big survey courses, oftenly they're explicitly weed out courses. And sometimes we tend to save the interesting capstone projects for the very end, when students are juniors and seniors, instead of front loading those and understanding that's part of what might make some students stick it out. So I think some of it is from the curriculum. And I think we can reach more students, particularly students who are stressed out by being in STEM majors, if we make it easier for them to see these mappings.
Great. Follow-up question is, in your data, you see that lots of people endorse both communal goals and agentic goals. So they're not all or nothing, but people think that they're all or nothing. And so I'm wondering, is there a cultural reason for that? Is it because, like Dale Miller says, we have a norm of self-interest, that you're supposed to be self-interested, because if you're not, you're like a sucker in our society. And so if you think about, I'm doing all this stuff for others, then that's not what you're supposed to be saying. Are students all or nothing thinking part of our cultural inheritance, in which case it's like hard to change, or is it really just constructed in these fields, and could it be changed?
So I think part of it is our cultural inheritance. And I think if we had tendency to think more dialectically, it would be easier for us to see, two things as possible at the same time. But I don't think it's impossible. And so I think that when we see this when students, we ask them kind of what are your agentic and communal goals, draw them out for us, show us how they're related. Students will tell us, like, I'm going to college, that's an agentic goal. I'm going to college in this degree so I can earn money to also support my family. That's a communal goal, right? And so they can and do and spontaneously provide us with ways that they are mutually, shared and facilitative. But I think when we're thinking more concretely and at one point in time, they see it as more zero sum. So some of Andrew's data is using that construal level manipulation. And if we put people in that more distal, more abstract mindset, they do see their own goals as more facilitating.
Great. I'm going to go to Michael Martyr. That comment is, there's something that there's a risk in being strident about the conflict between the two goals. Michael, do you want to elaborate?
Right, I risk becoming strident. I don't wish to. The talk is wonderful and it touches on some things that are very concerning to me right now. And so I would love some of your thoughts on that. I think that the question of whether we are agentic or communal is something we like to tell ourselves stories about a lot. And these stories often don't represent who we really are or what we're really doing. And this concerns me greatly at the moment because I'm getting messages from the public school systems indicating that they are coming apart. And the way that they are coming apart really has to do with abandoning a lot of communal ties, both within schools and between schools and other institutions. So I don't think I can say it compactly, but I think we're beginning to pay the price for saying we are acting communally when we're not. And I think this applies a lot to university faculty, as well as other entities in the mix.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, I think in terms of culture change and thinking through not just what we say to students to get them into a particular major, but then what their experience is, I think that you're absolutely right, that sometimes because these are positively valued, at least in a superficial way, and I would say also in a deep way, but when multiple things come up, they can be the things that are seen as less important, or at least are off the table for a while.
We have some fabulous questions in the chat. I'm going to keep going. They're deep and profound, and they each require 45 minutes and a bottle of wine to fully answer, but we'll try to go quickly. So Uri makes the point that students are swimming in a turbulent sea of overlapping social worlds. There are different initiation rituals. They all have different costs. And I think that relates to this idea of how we're socializing people into our disciplines. And they're bringing goals with them from before, but they're also learning what's valued in a context. And there is a junction, there's like a transition point. So have you thought about the rituals that we use to inculcate culture? And I think, Uri, I think you're using ritual intentionally in its cultural sense, because it's about learning a culture. So I'm kind of curious what you think of Uri's question.
I think that's a great question. Like, we really have just started, maybe not just started, but this paper about motivational culture and trying to document what are the artifacts is under review now. And so it is a newer way of thinking about us, but I think thinking through those rituals is a really valuable way to go. So I think part of it, like when you think about a student experience, we often use the example of study groups. That might be one ritual that students engage in. And those can be agentically oriented. Some students go for achievement reasons, and some students go for social reasons, and some students go for the mix. Like, it's really both of those things that matters. And so I think as we consider kind of what departments or clubs or universities might do, workplaces might do, I think considering what are the rituals we have in place and what do those signal about goal opportunities is a really important one. We don't have data specifically about it, but I think from this cultural perspective, it's a clear next step to go. I love it.
And I know Uri has a number of culture building practices in his intro calculus class, talking about how you're going to be leaders in your field, and that's why he's pushing you. And it's
That's great.
like communal goals. Yeah, Uri. Okay, let's go to Kyle's question. Kyle's specialty is thinking about authenticity in people's goals. So I think it's quite relevant to this. Kyle, do you want to ask your question? Oh, we can't hear you.
What about now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I was just asking about whether people who are kind of already in these kind of fields where they feel this misfit, if you can speak to any of the behaviors they do to feel fit. And I just provided one example. Maybe they look outside of the field for communality and things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a series of studies that looked at belonging in particular, and how communal affordances can signal and then, belonging. So if you think that this is going to be a setting where your communal goals can be met, there are both direct and indirect ways that would lead you to think that you belong, if it matches your values, but also directly that people are there supporting you. And one of those studies, the student is Amy Belanger, who graduated a few years ago, and her dissertation was asking this question of, well, what happens to students if the communal opportunity is there, but it's not in STEM? Is there a benefit to that? And what is that benefit? And are there costs to that? And so she really nicely, very elegantly asked about general belonging. So how much do you feel like you belong? Are your belonging needs met generally, but also STEM specific belonging? And what she found was that when people had been kind of ruminating, reflecting on meeting communal goals through volunteer opportunities, but they were not science or STEM related, their general belonging was up. Like that was good and that's a win, but their STEM specific belonging went down. When students were thinking about, here's an example of a scientist who can meet these altruistic and collaborative goals in their job, then their STEM specific belonging went up. So I think that has really prompted us to think about, like, what do we mean by belonging, and belonging to where? And then the messages and opportunities, authentic opportunities to meet those goals are going to matter. And again, it's not that general belonging is not a bad outcome. It's a good outcome. But if our goal is to keep students in this particular pathway, then we need to think about opportunities in that pathway and not somewhere else.
Now I want to be mindful of time. We are at the end of our time, but we have a few fabulous questions. So I'd like to keep you on if we can, Amanda, to answer them. But if people need to go, we want to thank you for joining and remind you that our next speaker is Kayvon Stassen, who is talk about belonging, has created amazing programs for belonging and kept lots of people in physics and astrophysics, and a real leader. So the greatest hits will keep on playing starting next month. And we might even have our first in-person TxMI speaker series event with Kayvon next month. Having said that, though, let's continue with the Q&A. So we have Catherine Regal-Crum, who's asking if you could say a little bit more about what you think needs to happen in the K-12 years to change communal affordances. And Catherine, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Hi, Amanda. Great to see you. Fantastic talk, as always. I have lots of notes to follow up with you later. But yeah, it's just thinking so much about the college years, and you've talked about it so poignantly. And I just wondered if you could speak to us a little bit about the changes that you think need to happen in K-12, since most young women, when you ask them in middle school and high school, are saying they're not interested in engineering, not interested in physical sciences. So what can we do to bring those communal affordances of those disciplines up earlier so that more young women see themselves gravitating to these fields in the first place?
That's a great question. So that's the reason we were really excited to have at least one data set of pre-service teachers, because those are, like, most students don't go on in science at the college level. Like, they make their decision earlier, obviously, as you said. And so understanding what the stereotypes are of the people who are in the K through 12 classrooms, like their beliefs about these affordances, is really, really important, because they're going to be communicated in both explicit and implicit ways. We don't have data about, like, the actual in-classroom communication yet. Melissa Feasting did some work, and we have a publication with Naz Bautista, who's in Science Ed, that's where we present the data about these stereotypes. But we also had an experiment where we had pre-service teachers, science teachers, read, a genetics lesson plan, and we modified it to include communal content or not. We wanted their beliefs about, like, is this going to reach your students? Is it, is it going to be hard to do? All of that kind of stuff. We found that the pre-service teachers thought that the communally integrated content was going to engage students more, that students were going to do better and master the material better. So again, it seems like if we're thinking systemically, we don't want to put all the burden on overburdened teachers to do this extra work. But to the extent that our curriculum or activities can make it easy to outline, here's what this means, here's what it looks like, that's to the good. So Naz led us in writing a practitioner publication. We have an engineering activity that includes a rubric for communal aspects. And so, it has the typical engineering stuff of thinking about a wind turbine and design of that, but it locates it, in Puerto Rico right after Hurricane Maria, thinking about what are the different communities you're going to need to understand and what is success going to look like. And so that was one way that we tried to think through, like, how can we make this more accessible and define this as an important learning outcome for K through 12 teachers. But I would love to talk more about this because I think it's really important.
Okay, final question. So we went earlier in the pipeline. Now, last question is later. So we have a question from Pratik, which is thinking about after training and once people are in the workforce, is there also a sense in which the Great Resignation relates to communal goals and whether people feel like they have to work independently versus communally?
That's a great question. And I think brings up some earlier ideas as well in terms of like actual support for people, not just in their perception, but like, are they supported in the work that they want to do and need to do, as well as their family responsibilities. So it's hard for me to separate out the Great Resignation from the caregiver crisis, which I think is acute and a big contributor. And so I think that I think that when people feel that their goals are not being met, they look for ways that they can be met. I think that's the basic premise of our model. So to the extent that people felt like, yes, I can continue in this job, but it's coming at the cost of things I dearly value, then I'm going to look for an off-ramp. I'm going to look for another way to meet those goals. So we don't have data about that, but I think that within our framework, we would be able to at least, form some hypotheses and collect data along those lines.
Well, fabulous. Thank you so much for giving us so much food for thought. And we look forward to staying in touch about this work. There was one other question from Cameron, so I'm going to let him stay on after people hop off so he can ask you that question as well. But just hope everyone would join me in thanking Amanda for this wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And I look forward to talking to some of you over the next few days.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for that great talk. So my question was about basically whether students' goals predispose them to see affordances. So, for example, if a student really strongly holds communal goals, are they going to be more attentive and kind of more vigilant to cues in a learning context that signal affordances for those communal goals or not?
Yes, they are. And so we have one paper that looks at that specifically and in an experimental way, not in a kind of lived experience way. But we do find that the people who are communally oriented in terms of individual differences, that the affordance manipulation mattered more for them, and that they were more attentive to the cues within that experimental manipulation. So we haven't, like, to be frank, we find just that affordance perception is a much more robust predictor than the goal endorsement individual difference. And so in terms of the data, we've kind of followed that path more than goal endorsement. But we do see it as moderating the impact of these affordances or even the perception of the affordances in the first place.
Super interesting. Thanks.
Thank you. Great question.
All right.
All right. Thanks. All right. Thanks, Amanda.
Absolutely. Could I get the chat? Because I don't think I got all the questions and I would love.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So if
I
you
can
save it.
I can send you a copy of the chat.
That would be great.
Cool. Awesome. I'll do that right now.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Amanda.
All right, bye.
Bye.